Something has shifted in the last few days, and you can feel it in the way the people around Trump are talking. Not the public loyalists who always sound the same, but the inner circle operators who normally keep the machine quiet, disciplined, and on message. The reports coming out now describe a familiar pattern in political power. Once the perception of invincibility cracks, loyalty turns conditional, and conditional loyalty turns into open friction. To be clear, what follows is a rewrite of the narrative you provided, not a claim of verified facts. The point is to capture the dynamic being described. An internal team that once functioned like a fortress, now behaving like a coalition under strain, with competing factions, leaks, and strategy fights turning into public signals. In this account, the fractures aren't happening at the edges. They're happening near the center. And that's why the story matters. A movement can survive bad press. It struggles to survive a divided command structure. Because a divided inner circle doesn't just create embarrassment, it creates operational failure. For years, Trump's closest network has been treated as something like a private guard unit, intensely loyal, aggressively disciplined, and willing to absorb controversy as long as the leader's grip on the narrative remained strong. When that kind of group starts leaking against itself, it isn't only gossip. It's a sign that trust is draining out of the system, and trust is the fuel that makes high-pressure political operations work. The first thing insiders reportedly noticed was the change in tone at planning meetings. Not the loud arguments you'd expect from tabloid stories, but the colder kind of conflict. People withholding information, refusing to commit, pushing decisions up the chain so they can't be blamed later. When a team starts protecting itself from itself, it's already sliding into dysfunction. In this telling, the trigger wasn't one event. It was accumulation, ongoing controversies that kept returning faster than the team could contain them, legal pressures that made every public statement riskier, donor and ally unease that forced strategists to balance bravado with liability management, and a growing sense among some advisors that the old style, maximum confrontation, maximum volume, perpetual escalation, was beginning to produce diminishing returns. That creates a classic split inside any power structure, the hardliners versus the stabilizers. The hardliners push for relentless dominance, rallies, aggressive messaging, constant attacks, and a show of force designed to prove Trump is still the center of gravity. They believe retreat is weakness, compromise is betrayal, and moderation is an invitation for opponents to press harder. The stabilizers see something else. They see risk. They see legal exposure. They see voters who may tolerate conflict, but recoil from chaos. They see allies and donors who want predictability. And they start arguing for tighter discipline, fewer improvisations, fewer off-the-cuff statements, more controlled appearances, a strategy built around reducing legal and reputational damage. That split isn't theoretical. It shows up in everyday decisions. What to say, where to appear, who to attack, when to go quiet, and how much to risk in pursuit of dominance. And the more those decisions are contested, the more the operation slows down. In a cohesive machine, the leader's direction becomes action quickly. In a fractured machine, direction becomes debate. Debate becomes delay. Delay becomes missed opportunities. And missed opportunities become more panic, which makes the leader lash out, which makes the fractures worse. That's the feedback loop described here. Another sign of internal fracture is the emergence of two messages at once. One faction says Trump is winning, unstoppable, and should hit harder. Another faction tries to soften edges, reassure moderates, and reduce escalation. When both messages leak into the public at the same time, the outside world sees incoherence. And incoherence is lethal to a brand built on control. In this account, that incoherence has been amplified by leaks. Leaks are not just embarrassing. They are a form of internal warfare. When people leak, they're not merely sharing information, they're shifting blame. They're signaling to outsiders that they were not responsible for a bad decision. They're positioning themselves for the future. And they're telling rivals inside the operation, I can hurt you too. Once leaks start, they invite more leaks, because every person who feels vulnerable will seek protection by controlling a narrative outside the leader's control. And that is how a private circle starts to fracture publicly. The emotional dimension matters too, because loyalty structures are personal, not just professional. Trump's political world is built on demands for loyalty, on public displays of obedience, and on punishing those who deviate. When that system works, it creates fear and discipline. When it begins failing, it creates resentment and volatility. In this narrative, Trump is described as increasingly irritated by dissent and increasingly obsessed with identifying who is against him. That obsession is not just paranoia, it's a strategic error. When a leader becomes consumed with internal betrayal, he diverts energy away from external strategy. He makes decisions to punish rather than to win. He becomes reactive. And reactivity is easy for opponents to exploit. You see it when messaging becomes impulsive, when targets shift quickly, when statements are revised or contradicted, when strategy looks like mood. And the staff around him has to manage that. They have to rewrite talking points, patch holes, and defend contradictions. That job becomes harder when the inner circle itself is divided over whether to control the leader or amplify him. Social media accelerates everything. In an earlier era, internal disputes could be contained by controlling access to the press. Today, a single screenshot can turn a private argument into a public narrative in minutes. Even the perception of leaked chats and back-channel disputes becomes fuel for commentary and speculation. And speculation can become reality in politics because perception changes behavior. Donors hesitate. Allies hedge. Surrogates become cautious. And the base starts debating whether the leader is still as strong as they believed. That's the strategic danger. You can lose power without losing a single vote simply by losing the aura that kept everyone aligned. And the aura depends on the belief that the operation is unified. In this account, the strategic consequences are already showing up. Meetings are described as longer and less decisive. Public appearances are debated intensely rather than scheduled confidently. Legal advisors push restraint, while political advisors push aggression. Fundraising strategy becomes more complicated because major donors do not like instability, even if they like the leader's politics. They want a winner, not a risk. And in a movement that relies heavily on small dollar energy and high dollar infrastructure at the same time, losing either side creates imbalance. If small dollar supporters feel confused, enthusiasm dips. If high dollar supporters feel nervous, money dries up. A divided inner circle risks both. The rebellion dynamic also changes internal loyalty economics. Previously, loyalty was rewarded with proximity and influence. Now, loyalty can feel like a trap because staying close means absorbing more blame if things go wrong. That's why, in this story, some people begin distancing themselves. They don't declare opposition publicly. They simply reduce exposure. They decline interviews. They quietly exit advisory roles. They stop taking responsibility for decisions. They wait. And waiting is a form of betrayal in a system built on constant affirmation. Another angle is the clash between the movement's emotional culture and its operational needs. Trump's brand thrives on confrontation. It energizes supporters. It creates a sense of permanent battle. But governing and legal survival require something else: discipline, consistency, and restraint. When the leader's instincts pull one direction and the institutional needs pull another, the team splits. And that split becomes a daily internal fight. The media then does what media does. It takes every leak, every rumor of infighting, every report of a clash, and frames it as collapse. Sometimes that framing is exaggerated. But even exaggerated framing can have real impact because it changes what outsiders believe. And what outsiders believe shapes what they do. If supporters believe the inner circle is fracturing, they begin looking for scapegoats. Factions form within the base. Influencers pick sides. Rival camps accuse each other of sabotage. A movement that once had one central voice becomes a movement with internal civil wars. And once internal civil wars begin, every external fight becomes harder because the leader is fighting two fronts: opponents outside and rivals inside. That's why analysts often say the most dangerous threat to a political machine isn't the opposition, it's internal fragmentation. The opposition is predictable. Internal betrayal isn't. Where does this go? In this narrative, there are only a few plausible paths. One path is consolidation. Trump identifies dissenters, purges them, and replaces them with loyalists who prioritize obedience over competence. That can restore internal discipline quickly, but it often reduces strategic sophistication. It creates an echo chamber where the leader hears only what he wants. That can lead to bigger mistakes later. Another path is forced moderation. The stabilizers gain influence, not because Trump changes temperament, but because the costs of chaos become too high. Messaging tightens. Public appearances become more controlled. Fewer impulsive attacks. The leader's rage gets managed. This can improve operational efficiency, but it can alienate supporters who prefer maximum conflict. A third path is continued fracture. Neither side wins. Leaks continue. Decisions become inconsistent. Public messaging becomes contradictory. Donors hesitate. Allies hedge. The base argues with itself. The movement loses energy through internal exhaustion. And the key point is that you don't need a total collapse for influence to weaken. Even modest fractures can erode the perception of control. And perception is the currency of political power. So the significance of this story isn't the drama. It's the signal. A leader who cannot maintain trust among his closest operators cannot maintain the kind of disciplined campaign and crisis management that modern politics demands. And once the inner circle stops acting like a unit, the outside world starts treating the leader differently. Less fear, less deference, more open resistance. That's when the private army stops being a fortress and starts being a battlefield. And once it becomes a battlefield, every day becomes a test of whether the leader can still command, still unify, still punish, still reward. Because the moment people inside decide that loyalty no longer guarantees protection, the movement changes permanently. The question becomes not, how do we win together, but how do I survive this? And that's when power begins to drain away. Quietly at first, then all at once.